Hello, my name's Naranjan, the host of Master of Your Crafts podcast. Learning from leaders who are continuously inspired, passionate, and driven to align with their soul purpose, sharing their gifts to bring healing to others. The music is composed by Rebecca Everett. Today is episode number 107, and I'm going to share with you a delightful conversation that I had with Richard Rosso, a filmmaker, author, and master storyteller based in Los Angeles. He honed his skills on hit TV shows like This Is Us, Grey's Anatomy, and 24. He'd written award-winning books, taught storytelling workshops to over 15,000 students of all ages. His passion of the creative process led him to develop and empower students in expressing themselves through storytelling and conquer their own fears of public speaking. He's been a guest lecturer at numerous universities, including Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and NYU. So I share with you the conversation I was delighted to have with him right now. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Richard. How are you, Richard?
I'm doing great. How are you, Naranjan?
I am doing well. I'm curious to get into this conversation, to delve into it, because you come from such an enriched experience of expertise and background that you've chosen to take so many different routes. And one of them being really harnessing that mastery of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes, go ahead.
So my curiosity delves further into all these who, what, when, where, why questions, but I'm going to ask you a really big, bold question. What is it you believe about yourself? And do you feel it defines who you are?
What I believe about myself. Well, I believe that I am a communicator. When I meet people, I love to hear about their stories and impart my stories and my experiences. And I've found over time that I've worked as a storytelling professional. We'll get into that a little bit later, but I've worked as a storytelling professional for a number of years in various mediums. And I think that that's given me an incredible insight as to how human communication works and how we can use that and those tools of story and storytelling to heighten our communication. And so that's sort of me in a nutshell.
Have you found that delving into communication on a human level, there are other elements that are involved that allows that medium to flow much freely and much more candidly, if you will? And what does that look like for you? How has that shown up?
Wow, what an interesting question. You love to just dig right in, don't you? I love this. So, well, Naranjan, so let me just back up a second and give your listeners or viewers a chance to understand sort of where I'm coming from. So I've been a storyteller all my life, but I've been a professional storyteller in the entertainment business, movies, TV shows, commercials, also music videos for 30 some odd years. And so as I've worked with all sorts of incredibly creative folks, creating these projects, creating these concepts, I've realized that storytelling has an incredibly powerful set of possibilities.
Right.
And but that comes from my orientation in terms of entertainment, story for entertainment.
Right.
through TV shows and films. But then as I've continued, living life and moving forward through my life, and I had two kids, and we've raised them, and they're out of school now. I've realized the importance of storytelling in everyday life. And so there's been a bridge from my professional career as a storyteller into helping folks. Again, I teach classes. I work with entrepreneurs and startups and businesses to figure out how to harness the power of storytelling.
Right.
And so what we do is we go in and we work on storytelling techniques and help folks hone their storytelling techniques so that they can become better communicators, but not just professionally. It's on a personal and a professional level. And it really, your question is amazing, because it asks the question of how does this all intertwine?
Yeah.
And it does. And it's hard to separate ourselves from being storytellers personally and professionally, because there's a blur between the two. The more we tell stories in daily life, the better we become at doing that. And that helps us become better communicators when we're on the job, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so it's an amazing process that benefits really our holistic sense of self, because our sense of self is ultimately tied to our experience and our experiences that we've lived in life, and those inform us as storytellers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What was that tipping point for you where you saw the convergence of the two together?
Okay, so my dad was an amazing storyteller. His favorite medium of story were story jokes. Now, not the classic, setup punchline. His story jokes, one of them went on for 5 or 6 minutes before the punchline came. And sometimes the punchlines are a groaner in stories like that. And so he would tell these stories, and he would take on these physicalities and fun voices and some sound effects. And so he would bring these stories to life. All right, so smash cut, right? Film terms, smash cut to my daughter was 14, and she got her learner's permit, so she was learning how to drive. And we were driving around one day, practicing and everything, and something happened. And that evening at dinner, I said, "Oh, Allie, tell Mom the story about what happened today." And my daughter said, "Oh, Mom, I almost ran into a cat."
Mm.
And I said, No, that's not the story. That you basically just gave away the punchline if it was a joke. I said, no. The story is we came in, I'll tell you an abbreviated version. We came around a corner. There was a cat sitting in the middle of the road. She stopped, slammed on the brakes. We actually drove over the cat. We didn't run over the cat. We drove over the cat. It was in the middle between the tires. And we looked back, and the cat popped up from behind the car, went and ran off to live another 8 lives. And my daughter said, "Oh," and she got it. And I realized, so that it's interesting, because you asked what was the tipping point, and I tell that story very frequently, when I'm leading seminars or workshops or talking to folks about the power of story and how to tell a story. And I never really thought that incident at dinner that evening really was the tipping point, because I said to myself, wow, I grew up with my dad telling all these stories and everything. And I hope that I've imparted the same sort of love for story and storytelling to my daughter. But at some point, there was a little bit of a disconnect where she hadn't quite, and she was 14, or 15, she hadn't quite gotten to the point where she was able to, oh, I understand. Here's how I tell the story myself. And so from that point forward, I guess it became my mission to work with folks. And I guess I'm a bit of a story evangelist, right? Okay. Story is the way. It's the way of communication.
Yes.
And so that was, Naranjan, that was the tipping point.
Beautiful. I love it. But well, maybe, a little heartwarming for all those cat lovers out there. So
yes, that it lived. Yes, I doubt I'd be telling the story if she actually ran over the cat. It certainly wouldn't be as good of a story.
That's right. For sure. What do you feel are some of the attributes that connect you to your purpose and to you delving into this place of storytelling and really enriching interaction and communication with, be it
Mhm.
human to human or word to word on a book?
Wow, you have amazing questions, really, truly. Um, so one of the things that really drives me is a love of process.
Mhm.
And again, I sort of get that from my dad. I mean, we'd go on, back when I was a kid, it was all driving car trips. We didn't just jump on a plane and fly. It was driving, and we'd drive on old country roads, and we'd stop at this antique store or this, fruit stand, and every time we'd stop, my dad would get in a conversation with the owner or the,
Right.
someone who's, and so after a while, I was sort of like, oh, Dad, come on, please don't get in another conversation. But looking back on it now, that helped me understand the world a little bit better. And so I love the creative process. And so what I do is I feel like the webinars and the workshops that I lead or teach, they're really they're really an education in in the arts and
Yeah.
how to bring all of those arts together. I mean, if you think about storytelling, right? You think about the first cave people, and one goes down to the river at dusk and almost gets eaten by a saber-toothed tiger.
Yeah.
Well, he runs back and tells everyone, he tries to tell everyone without any language in the beginning,
Right.
don't go down at dusk because there's a saber-toothed tiger. How does he do that? I tend to talk with my hands a lot, right? So gestures, grunting, all sorts of visual cues. It's almost
Mhm.
like early game of charades, right?
That's
And
right.
so that brings in anthropology and sociology and psychology, and then we get into English and history and math, and I mean everything. I read, Naranjan, I read a couple of weeks ago that a statistic, and I normally don't like to put statistics and numbers into stories because they sort of right over people's head.
Sure. Yep.
But it said that 85% of all our daily communication is through story or some
Yep.
sort of narrative structure.
Yep.
And I thought, 85%? That's a really, really high amount. Now, I was talking to a friend the other day and he said, I think it may be upwards of 100. When
Mm.
you think about it, everything we do is story based. When we start to impart something that happened, it becomes a story. If
Yeah.
we're trying to persuade someone to do something or not to do something, it becomes a story. And with the story, it becomes more powerful. If
Yeah.
I just say, hey, don't do that. Well, chances are the person's if they're a bit of a contrarian, they're going to say, "Oh yeah, I'm going to do it," right? But if I explain and tell a story about what happened to me the last time I did that, then it's going to help that person understand what may happen to them if they do, whatever we're talking about.
Yeah.
So sorry to be a little abstract there, but so I'm really into the creative process, and so what I love to do is help folks become better communicators. I have people say to me all the time, I'm not a storyteller. And I say, okay, hold on. You don't have to be a storyteller. You don't have to get up on a stage and have a corncob pipe and sit in a rocking chair and weave tales about incredible lands or raccoons getting into the general store and messing everything up and getting into the flower. You don't have to be a storyteller to be
Right.
a storyteller. All you have to do is say to yourself, I want to communicate something, some idea, some concept, and I can use these story techniques to become better at that. And here
Mhm.
are, here are a few instances of where that comes in handy. Think about a job interview, right? If you're interviewing me for a job and you say, Richard, are you responsible? Are you punctual? And I say, yes, I am. Okay, you note that down and we move on to the next question. Now,
Mhm.
now if you ask me, are you responsible? And I say, yes, Naranjan. In fact, I work on the weekends as assistant manager at McDonald's. And last Friday night, we had a French fry fire and the manager was gone. I had to call the fire department. All of a sudden, you perk up and you say, huh, okay. Number one, I'm learning how Richard is responsible
Right.
through this story. And not it doesn't just stop there. I'm learning that Richard can think on his feet. He can communicate on the fly. In a job interview, boom, that story literally came out of nowhere, right?
Right.
And also on the resume gets written French fry fire,
Yes.
right? Well, when that interviewer is then a week or two later going, okay, I need to finally hire someone for that job. There was the person with the striped shirt, the person with the red hair, and the person with the glasses, the guy with the beard, and oh, Richard, French fry fire. I remember that story. Boom.
Mhm.
Instant cream rising to the top, right? And
Mhm.
so what it does is it gives us a connection point so that we can connect emotionally.
Yes.
And when I say emotionally, I don't mean, oh, crying. An emotion can be laughter and fun and
Right.
happiness, or it can be sad, or it can be sorrow. I mean, emotion runs the whole gamut. But the
That's right.
point is, we can use story to help people remember us, remember information,
Yeah.
tell information about us that they wouldn't have known otherwise, but in a way that they can latch onto that and retain.
Yeah.
So I could use a story in a job interview. If I'm pitching a product or an app or a program or a service, I can use a story to help seal the deal. I can use a story for funding. I can use a story if I'm a leader and I'm working with a team or I'm working with a whole organization and I'm speaking with 4 people or 400 people.
Mhm.
I can use story to my benefit to help connect with those folks and create a connection that goes beyond just the time that we spent together.
That's right. That's right. How did you come to the understanding or realization that perhaps this is one of your callings?
Well, I wrote a children's book back in 2011, and as I started working on publicizing it, I started going out to schools, and I was doing school assemblies for kids, and I would project the pages of my book up on the screen, and I was doing school assemblies for anywhere from a class of 20 kids to a group of 200 or 300 kids in an auditorium or a gym.
Yeah.
And so I would project this book with the pages, and as I read through it, I would really sort of assume the characters,
Mhm.
and I also peppered the book with a bunch of call out words
Mhm.
during various scenes. I call them because I'm
Mhm.
from the film business, I'm
Mhm.
in the entertainment business, and I realized with the interactivity of all the kids who were interacting with me throughout the telling of this, or the really sort of performance of my children's book, I realized, oh my gosh, that was when I really realized this connection, and that was about the time that my daughter was almost hit the cat, or and so really everything came together in a confluence of, oh my gosh, I was going out to schools and reading my book, and my daughter was at home, and I was saying, you don't know how to tell a story. Here's how to tell a story better. And the experience of living with my dad and hearing his stories over my entire lifetime, I just sort of went, wow, there's something here. And it's interesting, Naranjan, because we don't teach storytelling in school.
Right.
And the word itself, storytelling, feels a bit archaic. It feels a
Mhm.
bit old fashioned. And there, if you Google storytelling right now, I mean, there are corporations that have storytellers on their staff, right? There are cities that have storytellers on their staff. There's the realization that storytelling is incredibly powerful for a lot of the reasons that I've been talking about, and even more. And so what I've done is I've realized this value of storytelling, but what I do is I take it back to sort of its base foundation. So I started doing these workshops, and I created a curriculum for elementary school kids where I go in and each session talks about a different kind of story. The first session
Right.
is a history of storytelling and sort of the example of the cavemen trying to get away from the saber-toothed tiger and how cave people communicated back then.
Right.
And then we talk about, well, how do we tell a joke, a story joke? and a tall tale and the embellishment and the physicality and the fun sound effects and voices. And then we get into telling a ghost story.
Right.
Or for older kids, for middle school, high school, or even at college age, it's an urban legend, which is sort of the grown-ups version of a ghost story.
Right.
I don't know what it is, Naranjan, about ghost stories and urban legends, but they are gold. They are so viral. They just suck people in. There's something about being scaring other folks and being scared yourself that is just so much fun.
Mm.
And so what we do is and then we have other kinds of stories we tell as well. But those are sort of that's a good sampling. And what we do is we work on telling these stories. So I go in each session, I tell a story, and tall tale, ghost story, and then I deconstruct that story. Now, of course, I don't use the word deconstruct when I'm working with
Right.
second or third graders, but when I'm working with high schoolers, college students, and graduate students, or I'm working with startup founders, entrepreneurs, we deconstruct the story and figure out what is it that makes that type of story work, a tall tale, a ghost story, a joke, and how can we use those storytelling techniques in other types of storytelling that we use professionally and personally. And so with kids, we discover, well, what's scarier? A ghost story that takes place in the day or a ghost story that takes place at night? At night, of course. Why? Because you can't see what's in front of you. I mean, everything sort of has a reason, and it has a reason deep down. And so then we take those skills and we put them as a template over opportunities for storytelling in everyday life. And for kids, it's, when they get home and they're at dinner and their parent says, "Hey, what happened today at school?" Nothing, right? No. That's a perfect opportunity. You could create a tall tale combined with a ghost story that happened at school,
Mm-hmm.
and entertain your parents. And then, of course, when we get older, those opportunities are a job interview, a pitch, running a team, and telling stories that help that team grow and mesh together. And so that's really what I've done is sort of taken the creative process of storytelling and story structure and broken it down, deconstructed it, and then I build it back up with folks. And my teaching philosophy is very Socratic. I love to put something out there when I know the answer, but I play dumb, and I get whoever I'm working with to help find the answer, because ultimately that's what really helps is finding the answer. I mean, it's easy to give someone the answer, but if they find it on their own, then they've got it, right?
Through everything that you've shared in terms of the storytelling, the communication, how has it enriched your life
Oh,
on a deeper level of we ran over a cat versus here's all the other spectrum, the scene, the story, the backdrop, all the other elements literally involved in a storytelling. How has that changed not only your life, but obviously it's changed your career and your trajectory of how you've navigated your career? Is there a specific story that you would like to share that is relevant to it having another layered approach of how you've got to that point?
Sure. So one thing that I haven't mentioned that sort of helped or drove all this is we had a son. He was 18 in 2009, Nick, and in 2009 he was in a car accident and he passed away. And yeah, and that's sort of the fourth. I mean, I've talked about my dad, the storyteller, creating this children's book and going out and telling and using it as a story-based teaching tool. Then my daughter, but really my son was, I don't know if you remember, I said I published my book in 2011. Well, Nick passed in 2009. And so during that 2 years between when he passed and I published the book, the book is based on an event, an incident that happened when he was still alive. We went to go out for dinner with my mother-in-law, and the short story is a guy stole a parking space from her. And over the dinner, we joked, "Oh my gosh, that guy was a pig. He stole grandma's parking space. He's a piggy. We should write a note for his car. Oh, we should come up with this thing, a ticket to let people know when they're a piggy. It would be the piggy ticket." And so this concept of how our actions affect others became my children's book, Piggy Nation. And it's all about what you do when you're a piggy. And you don't have to be a pig to be a piggy. You could be any sort of tall, short, person or an animal in the land of Piggy Nation. But Nick's spirit really infused that whole concept and kept it going. And then as I started going out and doing school assemblies, I felt an energy and a spirit flowing through me. Now, I've always loved working with kids and children. I was camp counselor, but there was something about going out and being with 300 kids in an auditorium and performing this book that had come out of an incident that Nick was there. He was there when it happened. And so there's this sort of through line of energy and spirituality and spirit that continues from when he passed. And, my wife and I were still together, fortunately, but we were part of a couples grief group.
Sure.
And through that experience, I watched other people, when you're going through that intense grief, you're looking for ways to connect with your loved one. And you're looking for ways to celebrate them. And very often, Naranjan, people don't want to talk about someone who's passed. They don't, look, I understand that concept now. And if I come across someone who's lost someone, I can help them talk about their loved one, tell stories about their loved one. But I wouldn't have felt comfortable doing that before Nick passed.
Sure.
Because I didn't understand how it all worked.
Right.
So ultimately, that's led me to the understanding and realization about this power of story and storytelling. And we've discussed how story can be very powerful for job interviews and pitching, et cetera, but it can also be a really, really powerful tool to help. And tool is not really the right word. It sounds so antiseptic, but to help deal with grief. And whether that grief is someone's past or someone has had an accident and they're debilitated in some way or another, you still grieve for the person that they were before. Our next door neighbor of 25 years was just diagnosed last year with Alzheimer's. And so I've watched her lose her short-term memory. She has no short-term memory, but she can remember times from when she was a child. She was 4 years old. She came over from Germany and moved to Ohio. And so she remembers parts of those stories, everything. She remembers every single detail. And so to me, story, it's more about just our connection to each other. It's also really a touch point, connection point to folks that we've lost, because memories are stories and stories are memories. Yeah. As I remember back to some of the moments with Nick, well, a story evolves. A story just sort of spit it out, right? Everything I think about him, it may be a moment in time, but then I expand on that moment and it becomes a story.
Right.
And Naranjan, this is an incredible thing that happens, is you come across folks who knew your loved one and you didn't know it. And somehow you find that out. For instance, I worked with a director, and we've worked together for almost 30 years. And he was in New York working on a commercial. And he came back and he said, "Oh, I have to tell you about this thing that happened. I was working on this commercial and I was talking to one of the production assistants, and I said, where are you originally? Where are you from?" And she said, "Oh, I'm from Los Angeles." And he said, "Oh, I'm from Los Angeles. And where'd you go to high school, or where'd you live?" And she said, "Oh, I went to Pali High." And he said, "Oh my gosh, I knew I have a friend, one of my dear friends, his son went to Pali High, but he passed. His name was Nick Rosser. And she said, oh, I was in the same class as Nick. And
Mm,
she told Chris a story about Nick. And
mm,
Chris imparted that to me when he got back. I mean, think of, it's like a treasure chest, opening up this
mm,
treasure chest and hearing this story
mm.
about my son from someone that I didn't even meet. This was through Chris, my friend, the director. And it was just, I mean, it was so unbelievably touching that
Mhm,
after, I think this was 11 years or so after Nick had died.
mhm.
And so to hear a story like that of this connection that she had with Nick that I would never have known about,
Right.
it was really incredible. And so so for your listeners or viewers who are dealing with grief, and again, it can be the loss, excuse me, it can be the loss of someone,
Mhm.
or it can be some sort of a debilitation of some sort.
Yeah.
Um, you can connect to to your loved one or to the past version of your loved one through story. And also story can be incredibly it's an incredible connective tissue. When I spend time with our next door neighbor, and she's now in an assisted living home, but when I spend time with her, the stories just flow back and forth, and it's a way of connecting. She still knows my name, but there are times when she can't even remember the fact that we just had lunch 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And so story, she can process things through story that she's unable to process in other ways. It's truly incredible. So
Yeah.
so really story is so much more. I mean, I said 85%. Maybe it's 125%. Maybe we're
Mhm,
communicating through story in ways, through an
mhm,
energy to loved ones and folks that we don't even know about.
mhm.
So the 85% turns into our subconscious and more that's going on than we even really realize or know.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that story. I recognize the vulnerability of it, even though it was in 2009. So thank you for sharing that.
No, absolutely.
One thing that I recognize as you're talking and as I'm making the connections in my own reference points is ultimately the story about the self. Because
Hmm.
as we can engage externally, be it a story, a movie, a TV show, a book, a classroom, it's ultimately the internal dialogue and the interaction that is held within the self. So it's the relationship with self, the story with self, in not only in how it's digested, but how it feels,
Hmm. Hmm.
especially in terms of the environment. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the spectrums of stories and how it can translate beyond the word. So
Mm.
through music, through environments, through scenery, through the physicalness of it can be all amplified without us even uttering a word. I mean, we joked early at the beginning of this conversation of how we're going to do an interview if we can't hear each other,
Right before we got the sound to work.
right? But in reality, that's actually true. I remember going to my first opera. I don't speak.
Mm.
And it was all through the feeling, the visual, the environment is how you capture the story. So, but it then becomes an even deeper layered interaction and engagement of how I reference it and how I digest it for myself, which I
I,
think is the beautiful tipping point of the stories beyond external, but the story between self and
I
all
love
parts of
that.
self.
I absolutely love that. And so let me add something to that. Let's talk about music for a second.
Mm-hmm.
And music, sans lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Vivaldi's The Four Seasons.
Right.
Now, some of your listeners may have heard it, may have not have heard it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Imagine a symphony of four seasons.
Yes.
So as Vivaldi works through the seasons, you you can close your eyes, you can sense winter, you can
That's
sense
right.
spring and the blossoming and in the music that he composed for the symphony. It evokes winter, spring, summer, fall
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
ways that only Vivaldi could have done.
That's right.
And but let's also take it a step further.
Mm-hmm.
So think about music and how powerful music is with memory.
Mm-hmm.
Now I can hear a song and it takes me right back. There are certain Led Zeppelin songs. I
Okay.
remember buying Led Zeppelin 4 and
Okay.
Presence, so there's a touch point, or Pink Floyd. I was a big Wish You Were Here. It was my first Pink Floyd album. And so I listen to some of those songs and they still take me back to that moment or that time in my life. How
Mm-hmm.
does that work? But again, it's all part of the story. Now, it's interesting because, there may be people say, nah, I'm really not into Led Zeppelin or really not into Pink Floyd. Oh, but that jazz, Miles Davis, the song
Mm-hmm.
So What? Boom. It just takes me
Mm-hmm.
back to, and so we all have varied experiences. And ultimately, that's the beauty of our personalities, of our creativity, of our individualism, because all of our experiences, there's the whole nature nurture question of,
Yeah.
if you take two twins and you separate them and one lives in a rich home and one lives in a poor home, and what ends up happening? Do they become the same person? No,
Yeah.
because you've introduced a different environment.
Yeah.
Well, we all have a different, we have shared experiences, but we also have a variety of experiences. So there's subsets that overlap.
Mm-hmm.
And in story, that's one of there's we could do a whole nother podcast about the
Mm-hmm.
brain science behind story
Mm-hmm.
and storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll tell you one concept that's really important. It's called narrative transport.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept of narrative transport, think about your favorite book, think about your favorite movie. When you open that book and you're reading it, everything else just falls away.
Right.
The beeper can be going off on the oven, your pizza's burning, there's someone knocking or ringing at the doorbell to deliver a package or something, and you don't hear or sense any of it
Yeah.
because you were so sucked into that book or movie, TV show, song, whatever it is. It has transported you, narrative transport, it's transported you to a different time, place,
Mm-hmm.
uh, a different mindset. And
Yep.
so ultimately, whatever story we're telling, we're trying to transport our audience.
Yeah.
Now, Naranjan, there are all sorts of different reasons we tell stories. There's pure education,
Yeah.
pure entertainment, persuasion, reflection, all sorts of different reasons we tell stories. But ultimately, whenever we tell a story, we want to transport our listener. And again, if you and I were out to lunch and you asked me, hey, what happened yesterday? And I told you a story about the cat, my daughter driving, then that would, I'd be probably just telling it to you just to entertain.
Mm-hmm.
But I could also step up in front of an audience of 200 or 300 people, and now I'm working on entertaining and persuading to either buy a product or a
Right.
service or something like that. And so ultimately, our goal is to transport our audience through narrative transport
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
a place where cell phones, texts, thoughts of, oh my gosh, I have to do this, my to-do list, just fade away and fall
Mm-hmm.
to the wayside,
Right.
so that the connection point and the emotion of that story comes through. And after the story's over, then the listener or the audience then takes that and it resonates with them. That's what happens when you go and you see an incredible movie. You
Mm-hmm.
think about it for a day or two or
Mm-hmm.
three sometimes afterwards, and you
Mm-hmm.
mull over in your brain what happened and
Mm-hmm.
why did the character choose that. How did they end up where they were, and how does that impact our lives?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the second part of storytelling, is
Right.
connecting with your
Beautifully.
audience in a way that impacts them about what they're living and what they're living through. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you can tell a story that transports your audience to a different place, and I mean, not physically, but mentally, and helps them figure out something in their lives, then, oh my gosh, transformation.
Powerful. It's powerful even just being in a place of absorbing that and digesting it
Mhm.
and having the opportunity to witness it.
Oh yeah.
Because not everybody can.
Well, that's part of, again, with our relationship with Nick. Our relationship with Nick is ongoing because there's still an energy. There's still
Mm-hmm.
memories about him. There's still stories that we tell about him,
Mm-hmm.
and we celebrate the years that we had with him in ways that we recall those stories and memories.
Yeah.
And but from an audience standpoint, someone I was in a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and someone said, "What does success? What does success of public speaking mean to you?"
Mm.
And someone said, "Oh, well, if I end up selling, a course, or I end up getting folks to buy my book, or and 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 someone else said, oh, when someone comes up to me afterwards and they say, and I sort of piggybacked on this, when they come up and they say, oh my gosh, I never knew about these possibilities."
Right.
And I've had that happen so many times with school kids, adults,
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
They step back and they say, oh my gosh, I really never realized, I never really thought about the possibilities of using story.
Yeah.
I just sort of took story for granted. And when that happens, it's like an aha moment. They realize that they have the capacity and the technique then
Right.
to weave a tale, because ultimately, and you touched upon it in your what you were talking about a second ago, it's ultimately about us and our communication with other folks, and
Yep.
and sharing moments that resonate.
Yep.
And again, whether we're selling something or persuading or getting up at a funeral and telling a eulogy and celebrating whoever passed through a story about them. And sorry, it keeps dinging. I don't know how to turn that off.
Yeah.
But that is ultimately what that connection is about.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
about finding moments in ourselves. And Naranjan, I guess that's part of why I'm willing to open up and talk about Nick, and let folks know how I've used story and the creative process to become closer to his energy and his spirit,
Mm-hmm.
and feel that he's still with me.
Right.
Because it sounds kind of corny, but each time I do a workshop or I
Yep.
tell a story, or there's something of him in that and in there.
Absolutely. Yep.
And so you thanked me before for willing to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I sort of feel I have a mission. It's not my mission, but I have a mission
Mm-hmm.
with difference. But in helping people discover the amazing possibilities of connecting,
Mm-hmm.
not just with loved ones, but on a daily basis with loved ones, with through story and storytelling. And so ultimately, story and storytelling can amplify our creativity and our message, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd love to give your listeners a challenge. It's not a hard challenge. So once you finish listening to this, and you turn off your media and you go outside and you think about, as you live the next 24 hours or 48 hours, think about when the stories bubble up. And again, as Naranjan and I have discovered, I've actually discovered a few things in this discussion that I hadn't thought about before. And some of those are that the stories that we're telling ourselves, and the stories that we're using to connect with folks that we've lost, in addition to whoever we're going out to lunch with, or at the
Mm-hmm.
supermarket, we're in line and we're telling a story about, oh my gosh, this happened, I almost dropped a big whole thing
Yep.
of uh, think about and reflect on how many times a day or how much of your day is spent in story. And
Right.
again, it doesn't have to be outward story. It can be the story of, as you're watching a squirrel going around a tree. It can be
Yeah.
the story of, I've seen that squirrel before. I wonder where he's going. I wonder if he has kids. I wonder if, all of a sudden, the story is bubbling up through your consciousness, and it's how we process information in the world. So I want you to reflect on that as you go out and live your lives. Think about when story bubbles up and how you can use that and use storytelling techniques, voice modulation, pitch, volume, use your hands, hand gestures, physicality. How can you use those techniques to become a better storyteller, a better communicator as you go out and meet people in the world?
Right. Absolutely. It's an interesting challenge. It's a good challenge for people to allow that creative outlet to just flow.
Yes. Yes.
And
I love
just be, rather than just cutting it off at the knees, so to speak, and go,
Right.
okay, where's my to-do list? No, let's just sit in this flow.
I guess the addendum to that would be take your phone and either turn it off for an hour or just put it in, put it somewhere and walk away from an hour so that you're not drawn to it instead of paying attention to the stories that bubble up.
That's right. That's right. I love that. I love that, Richard. Thank you so much for sharing all your nuggets of wisdom and all the stories that come embedded with that, for us to have a much richer experience, not only with ourselves, but with a fellow human being. Be
Exactly.
it that they are alive, living with us, close by, or not. Because as from my perspective, everything is energy and everything has a frequency and a vibration, so we can connect to that. Just as words have vibration and frequency, as do memories, as we've talked about too. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Naranjan.
Yeah, it's been such an honor having you on the show and delving into this. So yeah, maybe we will do a part 2 sometime. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you. I'm Naranjan, and you've been listening to Master of Your Crafts podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review, and join me next week for another episode. Thank you for listening.